So the University of Southern California is really pleased to partner with Aurora. We have two institutes at SC who are collaborating to present this next panel of scholars and practitioners. My name is Salpi Ghazarian. I'm the director of the Institute of Armenian Studies. And the Institute is a bridge. The way we see it is that it's a bridge between the problems and the challenges facing Armenians in Armenia and those with the intellectual and the academic skills and passion to tackle them. Migration is a challenge facing Armenians today. Out-migration from Armenia, high levels of labor migration, in-migration of refugees from Syria to Armenia. It's indeed one of the social and economic problems and opportunities facing us. And it's fair to say it's not new. Armenians have been labor migrants for centuries, including the days of the British East India traders. We've been economic migrants from the Middle East, from Armenia to the West for decades, to Russia as well. We've migrated to flee war and conflict for nearly half a century. We face critical internal rural to urban migration, just as the whole world does. And of course, the massive migration that followed the genocide. So our attention to this topic is not just as global citizens, but it's as global Armenians as well. Let me introduce our partner, the USC Center for the Study of Immigration and Integration. And its director, Manuel Pastor, who is a member of the Armenian Institute's Academic Council as well, as is Professor Don Miller, who moderated the finalists panel at AUA the other day. And we're really grateful to both of them for both their passion and their wisdom. Manuel is Professor of Sociology and American Studies and Ethnicity. He is the holder of the Terpanjian Chair for Civil Society and Social Change at USC. And in addition to teaching and writing really widely too, on issues of demographic change and economic inequality and community empowerment, Manuel directs a second center at USC, the Program for Environmental and Regional Equity. Together, these research centers reach beyond the university to a civil society, a government, and a world in need of the solid facts, civil dialogue, and community-driven solutions. So I'm really proud to say that what we're doing here today in partnership with this honorary Cuban Armenian is in fact to put gratitude to action. We all have immigrant roots under, in fact, crisis situations. And today we seek together ways to take action through scholarship or in the field, as these panelists are, to express gratitude for what we have the opportunity today to do together. And Gareth's was good, I'm just gonna say it again, to not mourn, but organize. Thank you. And welcome Manuel, please. And thanks. Do you have the chair moved out?
So great to be with you. As Salpi was saying, I hold a Terpanjian Chair in Civil Society and Social Change. I've been spending quite a bit of time with Armenians recently, so they're thinking about changing my name from Manuel Pastor to Manuel Pastorian, so I can become really part of the family. I want to tell you a little bit, introduce our speakers, because some of their intros got lost in the shuffling back and forth. I'll tell you a little bit about the structure for today, and then we'll get started. So we've got Pablo Sariane Cernadas, who's a lawyer and a professor at the University of Buenos Aires. We believe that he may have had the longest plane flight here, so we're really glad that he's here. And he's also vice chair of the United Nations Commission on the Rights of Migrant Workers and Their Families. We also have next to him, Ali Noorani. Ali is head of the National Immigration Forum, which is in Washington, D.C. He is the son of Pakistani immigrants, and he's also the author of this brand new book. He insisted that I show it. There Goes the Neighborhood, which you can buy. Well, I'll give you a minute to go on Amazon.com. If you're not interested in buying it, I understand it's about to be made into a major motion picture.
Yes, and you're playing the lead role.
Exactly. Although Ali will be portrayed by Brad Pitt, so we're very excited about that. So next to Ali, Lori Wilkinson. She is also a professor at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Canada, Director of Immigration Research West. Very, very pleased to have her with us. Next to her, Hovik Etyemezian, who was born in Lebanon of Armenian parents. He has served with the UNHCR in Congo, Algeria, and Tunisia. He's now heading the Mosul office. That's quite a task right now. And next to him, Sherry Graham Talabani, also a lawyer, so we seem to be bookended by lawyers. So if there's any problems, we can be defended, which is good. She's worked for the State Department and Millennium Challenge Corporation. She's currently president and ED of SEED Foundation in Kurdistan. Let me tell you a little bit about the panel. I'm going to ask everybody at the beginning to just say a few minutes about who they are and what the single issues they want to make sure gets on the table today. We are actually, you should think about this conversation as happening in 3 arcs. After that introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about the fundamental causes that are driving migration and displacement. We're going to talk, secondly, about what are sort of best practices and things we should know about with regard to integration and resettlement. And then finally, we're going to do a little bit of blue skying about what really should a 21st century system of migration look like, and what would be the elements about getting there. We'll end a little bit with some final vision statements as well. Another complication for today, as we move from sort of big question to big question, you will be seeing some people who are going to participate in the conversation by video snippets, talking a little bit about some of their own expertise on these issues. So, big multimedia day. We'll see if we can pull it off. We hope to have a little bit of time for question and answer. We'll see how that goes. We'll start from the far right with Pablo, and we're going to ask each of you to just introduce yourselves and say quickly what is really the single big issue that you want to make sure gets into the conversation today. So starting over there.
Thank you, Manuel. Good morning, everyone. Let me first thank for the Aurora Initiative for inviting me. It's a really honor to be here. I have, for the last about 20 years, I have the privilege of working in the field of migrant rights on behalf of a number of institutions, civil society organizations, human rights organizations, university, UN agencies, and for the last 4 years at the UN Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers. Throughout these years, it has been largely evidence that migration is not only a structural phenomenon on the current times, but also a multidimensional phenomenon, as it has already been said early morning. However, migration policies have been increasingly framed through a very narrow, myopic approach based on myths and stereotypes rather than facts, based on short-term interest, economic and political interest, rather than in a comprehensive approach that includes both short and long-term responses or elements in order to respond to this structural phenomenon. These trends have led to migration policies that, in my opinion, can be called as a permanent state of exception. Why is that? It's because fundamental human rights recognized to all human beings and very basic principles of the rule of law do not apply to migrants, and particularly those who are in an undocumented situation. Therefore, migrants can end up or can be deprived of their liberty for months or years just because an administrative irregularity, including children, may end up in detention. Millions of children are being detained nowadays just because of their migration status. The families, thousands of families have been separated through deportation because the priority of deporting someone that is in irregular status have been prioritized to protect the family unit. Migrants cannot access in many countries to basic social services such as education, healthcare, and this is not only an issue of discrimination, but it's also a problem in terms of public health policy. I mean, education policy, because the results, the outcomes of this discrimination affects the entire society. So there is a number of contradictions between migration policy on the one hand that are putting people in a very vulnerable and marginalized situation, but then other social policy goals. So states are trying to fight against labor exploitation, against gender-based violence, but on the same time, the way that undocumented people are being treated, I mean, go in the opposite direction. So the key message that I would like to deliver is that is critical, it's paramount to design comprehensive migration policies that include all the dimensions of migration. So migration is mainstream under the mandate of education authorities, health, social security, gender policies, and so on. I think that is a critical element that we have to take into account.
Great, thanks. And one takeaway there is striking, which is that migrants are in this state of exception, but migration is a totally normal and human event that happens. So very, very striking. Ali, introduce yourself and what's the single big message you want to make sure gets out today, aside from the fact that you've got a new book?
Thank you. You're looking for a commission at the end of this. So my name is Ali Nurani. I run the National Immigration Forum based in Washington, D.C. Our mission is to advocate for the value of immigrants and immigration to the nation. We are singularly focused on the goal of bringing Americans who are really struggling with this debate into the conversation. In that way, we focus the majority of our resources on the engagement of conservative and moderate faith, law enforcement, and business leaders across the country. In the U.S., the immigration debate is divided into three particular populations. One population is the refugee community. Another population is the immigrants who have come legally or through the system. And then the third population is the undocumented immigrant community. In the past, I think there was an understanding among Americans that those are three different populations with three different dynamics. I think currently, those three populations have been put together into this concept of the other. And I think it is the other that is driving the immigration debate. So through our work, through the project that I took on, the point that I would want to make is that whether it's the world's migration debate or the United States immigration debate, it is not about politics, it's not about policy. It is about culture, it is about values. Because what happens is when the conservative native-born American in Kansas who's been there for generations sees somebody coming from Syria or coming from Mexico, their first question is, will my culture change? Their second question is, will my values change? And the third question is, how will my neighborhood change? And you can't answer those questions through a conversation that's based purely on politics and policy. You can only answer those questions through a conversation that's based on culture and values.
Great, thank you for that. I think another question people might ask when new migrants come is, are my food choices going to widen in ways that make a lot of sense? So let's hear from Lori, who you are, single thing you want to make sure gets into this conversation.
Thank you very much. So I've spent my academic career studying refugees, and what strikes me is there's some really good research out there, but a lot of it problematizes refugees. So it focuses on mental health and language acquisition issues in particular. And so my goal is to try to research refugees in a holistic way. Refugees as a whole person, refugees as not permanently refugees, as survivors and as citizens, or citizens in waiting. So I focused my research agenda on young people, because 60% of all refugees will arrive in their country of destination before their 30th birthday. That means a lot of things. It means a lot of them will have some or extended experience in the education system, so understanding how that happens and what happens to them in the education system is hugely important. Many of them will have decades of labor market activity that we need to understand in order to answer questions about what is their contribution economically, but most importantly, to look at issues related to what kind of contribution do they make to our culture? And so trying to look at contributions more positively than more problematically. I think the message that we need to think about, or I'd like to get across in our discussions this morning, is that we look for simplistic solutions, right? So the media needs to do more, or the government needs to do more. We really need to bring all of the stakeholders together, identify the champions of refugees and humanitarian issues, bring them together so that the messages can come out in different forms. So the media is one form, your government is one form, your politicians are another form, your ethno-cultural, religious, and community organizations are another form. And those together, when you hear those messages from different stakeholders, people will start to believe. And so my other area of research is on receptivity and welcoming society.
Great, and I really want to explore that because I think that's particularly what the index is telling us, is that the concerns are causing people to be less receptive, and that's a very problematic thing. I think all of you are heroes on this stage, but Hovik, man, you're in some tough situations that you're working in. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and the single big message you want to make sure gets out today to this audience?
Thank you. First, I'm thankful to Lori that she mentioned youth because I think I'm the youngest member on this panel. So I'm going to exploit that to the extreme. So I was, as you said, I was born in Lebanon of Armenian parents. My grandparents survived the genocide. I think I would like to also maybe throughout the conversation highlight some of the personal experiences, including issues of Islamophobia that exist today, whereas my grandparents actually were survived because of the generosity of many Muslims in the Middle East. So I think that's one thing that I want to get out of this. As you said, I've been working in the past almost 11 years in various countries, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Middle East. For the latter part, I've been doing humanitarian work. I think for me, what I also want to kind of get out today is the myth about the cost of humanitarian and development initiatives, because I think that's a fraction of the cost of war. I think we need to remind ourselves that whatever we do is, first of all, a fraction of what the needs are, and a fraction of the cost that we collectively as human societies incur when engaging in war. So I think that's one element. The other element is to break the myth about culture and how unicolor culture might look, but also us understanding that migration and refugees are actually a human capital, and there's positive aspects to that we need to emphasize.
Great, and let me just say on behalf of the panel, and because I'm celebrating my 61st birthday tomorrow, that I really appreciate you rubbing it in that you're young. So let's hear from Sherry. Who are you, and what's the single big thing you want to make sure gets into the discussion today?
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. So my NGO, Seed Foundation, works with survivors of violence and conflict in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Our focus has been women and children that were in ISIS captivity, but we do serve women, men, and children of all ethnic groups and religions. Our goal is to help them to start to heal and rebuild their lives and become contributing members of society. I'm here to talk about our long-term and holistic approach to recovery. Even though we're in a humanitarian crisis, we need to be thinking about how we can support people's future. The civil war in Syria, the ISIS invasion in Iraq has led to over 1.5 million displaced people in the Kurdistan region. Most have experienced extreme violence. Some groups, minority groups, were targeted with a genocidal campaign, in particular the Yazidis. The men were killed, the teenage boys were taken as soldiers, and the women and children were taken as captives and sex slaves. Thousands of those women have been able to escape to Kurdistan, but many thousands remain in captivity, being sold every few days, weeks, or months to new abusers and captors. So how did this happen? It's deeply rooted in the structural inequality in Iraq, where we can see it in all of the institutions and in the culture. A lack of tolerance and acceptance for other groups, other religions, there's no pluralism, no political pluralism, no human pluralism, and there is no gender equality. And this has resulted in astounding rates of violence against women, impacting every aspect of their lives. This is in the backdrop of decades of dictatorship, oppression. We had a genocidal campaign against the Kurds almost 30 years ago now. After the brutal dictator was taken out, we've had a decade of sectarian violence and insecurity, leading to an environment where that tolerates abuse and violence. It's better in Kurdistan. It's a more open environment. It's a more tolerant environment. The situation for women is better. But we have a deeply traumatized society welcoming a new wave of vulnerable, displaced people. So what do survivors need? I believe they need a long-term, holistic, comprehensive approach. And what we do is we integrate mental health services, so psychotherapy and comprehensive case management that looks at the whole person and all of their needs. So protection issues, mental health, physical health, housing, economic empowerment, and support networks, which are so critical to healing. So we offer these mental health services with a range of vocational activities to help people generate an income, recreational activities to have fun and friendship, and educational activities to improve health, hygiene, parenting skills to improve overall well-being. So I hope we can talk more about our holistic approach to care.
We certainly will be. So I'm going to move to the first kind of broad question and just call out folks. But let me say that one of the things I've appreciated about the Aurora Prize and the Aurora Dialogues is that it seems like it's an attempt to flip the script, particularly to deeply appreciate the Armenian genocide, but to move from the concept of victims to survivors, to shift the focus from those who are persecuting to those who are allies. And it seems to me that yet there's another challenge about flipping the script. And it's from thinking about humanitarianism as rescue to thinking about humanitarianism as prevention. That is, of dealing with some of the fundamental causes that are getting people to leave and trying to address those fundamental causes. I want to, if it's queued up, I can't see it, but I bet it is, hear from Michael Doyle. He's a professor at Columbia University. He's written numerous books, I think about 10 more than Ali, but who's counting? And he worked as Assistant General Secretary and Special Advisor to UN Secretary Kofi Annan on this issue of fundamental causes. And is that going to work?
To give you an example, the Refugee Convention of 1951, a wonderful landmark in international human rights and humanitarian law, nonetheless has been seen by many scholars as narrow. It includes grounds for awarding refugee status that are not consequent with the kinds of challenges that are faced around the world that endanger people's lives. We see, for example, protections that have been implemented in the 51 Convention on the grounds of race, religion, nationality, social group, political opinion. But what's missing in that catalog, of course, are the variety of circumstances that can force individuals and families to flee from their lives. It might include severe drought, civil war, generalized violence. Now, in some parts of the world, in Africa and in Latin America, these broader grounds for refuge are recognized, but not yet in a global platform in a fully adequate way. Now, many governments do, fortunately, adopt a broader view, but what they're missing are the legal grounds, the standardized understandings of what constitutes a legitimate claim for refuge.
So I want to start with Pablo, and we'll be jumping around. This issue of fundamental causes issues of inequality, gender inequality, income inequality. These are very, very dear to the way that you're thinking about how we actually need to address the drivers of migration. Can you say a bit about how you're thinking and working on that right now?
Indeed, migration has been increasingly driven by a combination of structural factors that can all be rooted on different ways of inequalities and asymmetries, and at three levels, in origin, at international level, and in destination. In origin, as we just heard, poverty, discrimination, armed conflict, social violence, and so on. I mean, in few words, the lack of opportunity for millions of people to live with their rights, with dignity, liberty, and peace. At the international level, just an example, there are some trends in terms of international trade agreements, the way that natural resources are being exploited, how the regulation of the foreign debt are factors that are also affecting the causes of migration. And in destination, at least two factors I would like to mention. One is the demographic trend in different countries and regions. And secondly, how undocumented migrants have increasingly become the cheap and protected labor force in informal economies in countries of destination. And these circumstances, of course, leads to a number of human rights discussions and challenges that could be summarized in the words of the Swiss dramaturg, Max Frisch. We asked for workers, but we got people instead.
So, Ali, can you say a word about how that's being looked at in the United States? Because I think when we think, for example, about the Central American children who came a couple of years ago, or people who are fleeing violence in Central America, there's a question, are they economic migrants or are they refugees? What are these drivers and how are we thinking about it?
Well, I mean, the drivers, and the gentleman who spoke on the video got to this. I mean, the drivers are a combination of civil, war, of economic crisis, of climate. I remember a conversation with the chief of the Border Patrol under the Obama administration, and it was particularly around the Central American unaccompanied minor crisis. And he said he expected those numbers to continue to stay high because of the drought in Central America. But in the U.S., there's very little acknowledgement of the physical environment in these countries. In fact, I think that when the unaccompanied minor crisis first emerged in the U.S., the Obama administration, frankly, refused to really see these women and children as refugees. And as a result, the narrative and the debate started off on very, very bad terms. And the president himself said he wanted to make sure that these children were never making the trip to begin with, instead of making the case that these were children fleeing strife and that needed to be protected.
Hovik, you're on the front lines of this. What would end your job? How do we get you to be able to retire in 10 years? What are the fundamental things we need to do?
I think you're jealous because of my age. You want me to retire? It's too early for me. I think a few things. I think when we speak about migration and movement of people, we somehow immediately talk about or insinuate a certain negativity. And I think in today's world, we are more interdependent than we were ever. But since the beginning of times, people have been moving. And now with genealogy, we're discovering that purity is, I think, a misconception. So I think that most of migration is actually goes unnoticed. It's very normal. And I think we need to put our dialogue within that that framework that migration is a reality and it's part of human history. So I think that's one point that I want to emphasize. And so, and it's normal for people to try to seek a better life and prosperity and try to move to other places where that potential prosperity can be found. Now, a minority of that group moves because they are forced to. They're forced to because of economic deprivation. That's a group. Environmental disasters, but also people who are forced to move because of conflict and violence. So I think for me, the broader migration needs to be actually welcomed. and I think my IOM colleague will be happy with me saying this. Now, the more narrow movement, which is due to violence and conflict, that needs to be addressed. And I think if I were to retire and hopefully open an ecotourism company in Costa Rica, I think for us to achieve that, we would need to look at the root causes of conflict, how we, as I said, and I will repeat myself a lot today, in saying how we humans invest in war as opposed to peace. I think there is that element of focusing on prevention work. Prevention is better than the cure. So I think that's the one element. Looking also at, from a more focused, localized perspective, look at some of the issues, the underlying issues that my colleague rightfully touched on, the disparities, the ethnic issues, the cultural issues, the gender issues, issues of xenophobia. I think we need to also address some of those underlying issues for us to be able to prevent as much as possible conflict and therefore as much as possible forced displacement. But when that happens, we should also not shy away from investing in both responding to humanitarian and development needs at once.
That's very deep and amazing, and just thinking about migration as a good that brings so much value and is such a transformation for people's lives. Sherry, a word from you, because you've had the distinct, and I suppose others have too, role of being both in the midst of Iraq and all of the change that's helping to expel people, and then being in Kurdistan in the process of receiving. How do we change some of these fundamental drivers?
So as I mentioned, this insecurity in Iraq, which is created by the lack of political accommodation and the lack of political tolerance and this wave of sort of a zero-sum game. So you really can't be safe unless your group is in charge. And you really can't have economic opportunity unless your group is in charge. And this feeds the grievances that exist today. And so we need to work, our opportunity now is to reach people who we haven't been able to reach before. Communities that were targeted, were marginalized before the conflict. They were poor, but they were marginalized, discriminated against. And if you look at the situation for women, where, as I mentioned, the violence is replicated throughout the political institutions, where physical power is who controls Iraq, and that's in the home as well. Now we have a new opportunity working with these populations to change, to use our mental health services and our recreational activities to work with these communities to build healthier ways to resolve conflict, to increase tolerance among individuals and groups, and to create much more healthy ways of viewing women's roles in society. And I think we have a really good springboard for working with the displaced communities. But I think if we're focused on the inequality that exists and that things aren't necessarily a zero-sum game, political accommodation can provide benefits to all. I think that we can slowly see change. We need to build new norms in the community that we're able to work with now.
Great.
And certainly empower women.
I'm hearing that loud and strong throughout the dialogues. I'm going to start shifting in the direction of the second sort of big arc around integration, and I'll be turning to Lori. Is there something anybody else wants to add on this piece about fundamental drivers that we need and prevention that we need to make sure is in the dialogue? Okay, the one thing I will add is I was asked this question yesterday, and the thing that kind of spilled out of my mouth was inequality. So it's certainly the gender inequality, the zero-sum politics that Sherry's talking about, but I think the global level of income inequality is both a driver economically, it's a driver of the violence, and it's something that we need to be paying attention to as well. We're going to turn now to what happens when people arrive in their new countries. And I want to, in particular, focus on populations that are vulnerable when they make that arrival. And so we're going to hear from Isabel Mota, who is Lisbon-based and president of the Board of Trustees of the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. Let's hear from her.
Eu entendo que as prioridades devem ser dadas às populações que se encontram em situação de maior vulnerabilidade e risco de perda de direitos básicos, condições e sobrevivência, condições de sobrevivência e dignidade, sendo que o que mais aflige, o que mais nos aflige são naturalmente as crianças desacompanhadas.
It's great. Well, so many of you are going to have something to say about this because I know probably you wrote a dissertation on the unaccompanied children, but I want to start with Lori. Because we often hear around immigrant integration that Canada is doing a good job. I know when I said that to you yesterday, you said perhaps it's a bit overrated. But can you tell us what you think are some of the good things that Canada is doing and sort of what are the shortfalls in terms of really integrating both immigrants and refugees?
Thank you. I think Canada is in some ways a bit exceptional, but also a bit the same. So in terms of exceptionality, our demography, I think, plays a role in that. So out of all of the people who live in Canada, 1 in 5 were not born there, and another 17% are children of immigrants. And that number, the percentage is increasing because without migration to my country, the fertility rate would be below 1. So immigrants and indigenous people are actually the largest fertility drivers too. So you've got a condition where people are close to or have some experience of the migration process. We also have a long history of bringing in immigrants and refugees. At this point in time, we're about to reach 1% of our population per year will be arriving to Canada as a permanent migrant. But another 0.5% are coming as temporary migrants, and many of them will stay as well. So you have this kind of constant churn of newcomers coming in that I think gives a different flavor to receptivity in my country. This is backed up by government legislation, which at some times has been strong and sometimes has not been very successful either. But I think at least having a government that's willing to talk positively about the contributions that newcomers make is very important. I think the other aspect is that as a receiving society, our settlement organizations, our governments, and our citizens really put a strong emphasis on economic integration. This means accessing language training immediately upon arrival, trying to get recognition of foreign obtained credentials, and getting a job. And for not everybody is going to need a job in order to integrate, but for many people, having a job is really tied to their sense of well-being. And so I think those center focuses in Canada make us a bit different than other countries.
That's great. Ali, I want to ask you, because again, this book is actually all about the way in which different communities have different reactions. So we could kind of talk about the US-wide attitude, but what you found is that there's very different approaches in different metropolitan areas, and a lot of it's about bringing together local leaders. And interestingly, you're working with a lot of people who we would normally identify as being quite conservative and sort of scared of immigrants, but there's big changes at a local level, maybe not at a national.
So I think that the majority of people who live in this world are good people. And they're incredibly worried and scared about the movement of people. And the way that I've been talking about this is that most Americans they love the Jose or the Muhammad they know, but they remain afraid of the Jose or the Muhammad they don't know. And I think what has happened is that people are living in a state of tension between wanting to be a part of a welcoming community, but also wanting to be a part of a nation that respects the rule of law. So so as advocates, as organizations, as public institutions, as organizations that are helping people integrate or even resettle into the U.S., how do we help people navigate that tension? That's the challenge. And so for the book, I interviewed about 60 people across the country. The majority of them were socially or politically conservative. But in a place like South Carolina, which has seen the fastest growth in the Latino population, second only to North Carolina, I found conservative faith leaders from the Southern Baptist community eager and excited to help Syrian refugees, regardless of their religion, resettle into upstate South Carolina. And that cuts against any perception or assumption that I have or had of the conservative white evangelical community in South Carolina. I also met in Houston with the senior pastor of Champion Forest Church, David Fleming. This is a church of a congregation of about 13,000 people. And he told me the story of how he embarked on a strategy to make sure that his congregation represented the diversity of the people, as he put it, within the shadow of his steeple. And again, this was all, a long-term strategy so that his congregation went from majority, if not solely, Anglo, white, to a congregation that had a growing number of Latinos and Asians, not only just represented in the pews, but represented in leadership. So the point here is that I found that the conservative faith leadership, the conservative law enforcement leadership, they're very important messengers to the public writ large of how to navigate that tension between being welcoming and being a part of a nation of laws.
And again, it's just so interesting that this happens at a local level. There's a great news story that came out from West Frankfort, Illinois, in which a town that voted about 75% for Donald Trump found out that the local manager of their Mexican restaurant was undocumented, and he got picked up by ICE to be deported. And they said, wait a minute, yes, we meant you should deport immigrants, but not Carlos. And they wound up, the fire department wrote a letter, said this guy's a great guy. The mayor wrote a letter. They got him out of detention. They sent a limousine to bring him home. So there's something about that's happening at the local level that's very different. Pablo, you spend a lot of time thinking about particularly vulnerable populations like children. Can you talk a little bit about that in this context of integration and resettlement?
Yes. Children have been increasingly involved in migration for the last decade, I could say, in different ways. I mean, not only children on the move, those who are migrating either alone or with their parents, but also children that remain in the country of origin while their parents migrated, or those who are born in the countries of destination. So they are affected in many ways by migration itself and how migration is being responded, but also children, I mean, and looking at migration issues through the lens of children is also having an opportunity. I mean, in order to think how important it is to have a long-term approach to how to promote integration, how children and adolescents might be key players in terms of promoting integration policies. And in that direction, the Committee on the Rights of Migrant Workers initiated last year a joint initiative with the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child in order to integrate both fields and to deliver guidance, policy guidance, some guidance that could help to promote policies that take into consideration the rights of the child, and then to seek integration through the lens of the child. In that direction, we are working now. We are doing regional consultations in each continent until next July, and hoping to release this joint general comment, which is a policy guidance, I mean, based on international human rights law, in order to help different stakeholders to promote through this children's rights lens a number of policy change.
You had a striking statistic that you shared with us yesterday about the number of countries that have signed the agreement on children's rights versus the number that have signed on migration.
Well, thank you for that question. I think that numbers reflect the number of challenges that we have ahead. I mean, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, was approved in 1989. And until today, I mean, it has 196 member states. So all UN member states but one. The Convention of Migrant Workers was approved just 1 year later, 1990, and until now only 51 member states ratified the convention. Only a quarter part of UN states ratified the very basic legal tool that international community designed for responding to the challenges in terms of international migration.
It's a striking gap. Sherry, you deal a lot with something we often forget about because it's easy to see these numbers, 21 million refugees, and what it means really is there's 21 million stories and 21 million traumas. So can you talk a little bit about the healing work that you're engaged in and why we should take it so much more seriously than we do?
Sure. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that we're facing a mental health crisis in Iraq. And as I mentioned, we've got decades of violence and that people have internalized. And so in this new crisis, not only do we have the individual terror and child trauma, I'm glad you raised the issue of children. We have every woman that escapes with her child who survived has been exposed to extreme violence, children as young as 6, sexually abused, physically abused. We have radicalized boys who were in ISIS training camps who were taught to be violent against their own family. So the psychological needs are very deep, and at the same time, the skills and the capacity to treat these needs is very low. And the stigma of mental health issues is incredibly high. So we do mental health awareness to try to reduce the shame of getting help, telling people it's normal to seek assistance, especially when you've been through such traumatic and life-threatening events. We also, our integrated approach allows people to go for baking class, not necessarily, nobody knows that she's coming in for psychological services. And we're focused on investing in building capacity. So we have a massive education, training, and supervision program funded by the US government that we're doing with a local university to integrate trauma, recovery trauma specialty into the psychology program, and a program for workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, case managers, training to raise their level of skills, and it's a very intensive, long-term program.
Hovik, if you don't mind me asking this, I'm not sure we prepped this, but you're on the front line. All of you are, but gosh, Mosul. What do you do to heal yourself? The people who are involved in this work also need to be constantly replenishing their own mental energy.
I mean, you tricked me in this. I want to still cheat and comment a little bit about the question in general, and then we can come to my mental sanity or the lack thereof. When it comes to refugee crises, we in UNHCR and Humanitarian family think of 3 solutions. We think about return, we think about local integration, and we think about resettlement. Now, most refugees are hosted by developing countries, as the graph showed, and mostly in neighboring countries surrounding the conflict. So, and their challenges revolve around the issue of return and the issue of integration. Whereas for resettlement countries, you have the issue of resettlement and local integration. So I think there's that difference. There are a lot of similarities and overlaps, but to give the example of the Syrian crisis, because before Mosul, I was managing Zaatari camp for 2 years, and there you are dealing with a huge influx of refugees, Syrian refugees, in a country like Jordan and Lebanon who have difficulties, who have economic challenges. So I think one aspect of accompanying the euphoria, because at the beginning of a crisis, there's this euphoria of receiving refugees, open door policy, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan receive millions of refugees, but soon after, issues come out. And I think one issue that we need to really address is economic, is to make sure that when we start humanitarian assistance, we pay attention also to the host community and start immediately looking at both the economic empowerment of refugees and the economic empowerment of local populations. If that we get it right, and we almost never get it right, then issues of xenophobia will be less, issues of tolerance will be less, because there will be a win-win situation. So I think that's one element. I'm not going to take too long. There's health, which is another important, and my colleague from MSF, I hope she'll be happy with me mentioning health, talking about primary, secondary, and mental health. We really need to focus on that from the beginning, again, for refugees and host communities. And therefore, adopting inclusive policies is essential from the beginning, and adopting both the humanitarian and development kind of approach from day one is important, and we don't have that. What we have is our donors focus on humanitarian assistance. We don't even have enough to provide humanitarian assistance, and we don't get at all traction on development from day one for both host communities and refugees. For resettlement, you have the additional challenge of integration, in a sense that locally in the region, language is the same. Culturally, there's a lot of similarities. When people move overseas, then you need to have very inclusive policies, where language teaching, in addition to economic empowerment, more tolerance and understanding of difference of culture is important. I don't think I have enough time for my mental sanity question.
That was a smooth move. But you've actually shifted us into this next question, and then we'll begin closing up pretty quickly. What does a 21st century system of migration look like, which you've kind of touched on with your answer. But let's hear from Art de Gaus, who is from the Netherlands. He was Deputy Secretary of the OECD, responsible for employment, entrepreneurship, and social reform. He's now Chairman and CEO of Bertelsmann Stiftung. Go.
We need a new global governance for migration in the 21st century. This will be a century marked by greater mobility, be it forced or voluntary. The new governance must be guided by the principle of fairness. We must ensure globally that voluntary work migration will be managed in a way that migrants, immigration countries, and countries of origin all benefit from mobility. And therefore we need new thinking about the nexus between migration and development, and new mobility partnerships between sending and receiving countries. The very system of refugee protection has to also be improved by a better crisis management, dealing with conflicts and civic wars, better integration of refugees in the neighboring countries, and generous resettlement programs worldwide. But let's be serious about the political climate. The current anti-immigration tide in countries like the US, Britain, or across the European Union is indeed fueled by economic anxiety and security concerns. The cultural factor also, especially the rejection of Islam, not only in its extremist variants, plays a role. And these fears and concerns have to be dealt with by making the case that migration, as such, in principle, benefits all parties involved. In fact, aging continents like Europe are dependent on migration for the future economic success.
Great. I'm feeling pretty high-tech that I'm interviewing people via video, too. But Pablo, I know you have some thoughts on what this 21st century system ought to look like.
Well, first, I can't agree more with this statement. I think we have at least two scenarios ahead of us. One based on how migration or human mobility has been responded until now, mainly for the last maybe decade and a half or 2 decades, which may lead us to more social conflict, asymmetries, inequalities, discrimination, xenophobia, and these kind of issues, and the root cause is not being addressed properly. Or another scenario that is moving to this global leadership, global governance, that in my opinion needs, of course, political will, political courage, definitely, concrete commitments that can be followed up, that can be measured. We are expecting that the Global Compact end up on having something similar or the closest to some kind of banding or measure process, such as at least the SDG process. Otherwise, I think we will be ending up of new declarations after declarations, but without having the proper commitments, including some kind of plan of action directed to address the root causes of migration, and on the other hand, to promoting integration, which should be based and built up on the protection that comes from international human rights law.
Laura, your thoughts? I know that you both study this and you're working as well with local and national groups in Canada. What should a 21st century system really look like?
I think, first of all, the message that refugees are people, and they're people just like us. I think that's a message that needs to be emphasized in any kind of new regime for migration. I think bureaucracy is a huge problem that can be overcome. So in my country, it takes on average 7 years for a refugee to get to Canada. That a lot can happen. A lot of bad things can happen in 7 years. And really, I mean, the fact that my country could bring in 40,000 Syrians in 4 months, it was backbreaking work, but we know that it can be done. So the bureaucratic gridlock, I think, needs to be addressed. And then when immigrants and refugees arrive to Canada, I think we need to look at this as a multi-stakeholder approach, bringing together your politicians with positive messages to call out politicians who are racist. And there's politicians who are racist in my country. To have government at the provincial and federal levels and the municipal levels working together to ensure a seamless transition to my country, but also bringing in the ethnocultural, the religious, and the other community organizations that also want to help bring people together. But we also need to think about businesses as well, because businesses played a large role in the economic integration of immigrants and refugees in my country. There are many examples of positive success stories in my country, and I think that's a stakeholder group that's often left out.
Great, and it's what the next panel would be about. We're going to come to our closing question, which is actually first going to be answered by Ian Bremer, who is president and founder of the Eurasia Group, which does political risk analysis. He's foreign affairs columnist and editor-at-large at Time magazine and of German Armenian descent. And Ian, let me ask you, given the worldwide crisis of migration and refugees and displacement, what gives you hope?
Hi, I'm Ian Bremer, president of Eurasia Group. And you've asked, what gives hope? What gives me hope? What keeps me working on some of these issues of refugees and migration, humanitarian disasters? And, I guess I have two ways of answering that. The first is that I'm an existential optimist. The extraordinary opportunities that we have this time that we're living, where technology and economic progress has meant that we've taken half of the world's population out of extreme poverty just in one generation. Humanity's never done anything remotely like that in this short term we're on the planet. Anyone that's living at this time has to just be humbled by the extraordinary good that humanity is presently doing. It outweighs everything else. If you keep that big picture and don't just focus on the headlines in the media, which of course are all about it bleeding, so it leading, making you, I think that gives you a lot more hope. But the other point, which is much more important, is that human beings respond to crisis. Human beings respond to adversity. When life is easy, we don't try as hard. We get a little bored, we get lethargic. But what we know is that we find the best in human beings when they're challenged. And there's no question that some of the challenges that we see right now in terms of the Middle East, the extended Middle East falling apart, the resources not being there, the education not being there, the radical Islam growing, the refugees streaming from there into other countries in the region and from there to Europe and all over the world. These issues are not going away. They're getting bigger. They're getting more acute. And humans around the world are becoming more aware of them. And as that occurs and as it becomes more of a threat, we will respond. And some of that response will be, we don't know these people, we don't trust these people, and it'll be a knee-jerk response of hate and alienation and frustration. We do that when we don't know, but a lot more of the response will be this isn't right, what can we do about it? It's going to be human beings responding to their common and collective humanity. We're capable of that. I think that's the response that you will eventually see that will succeed. It's certainly what gives me hope. And the fact that I and many around this project have both the resources and the readership to the influence to make a difference means that you really have no choice but to, right? I mean, it's one thing when you feel powerless. That breeds hopelessness. But when you actually have power, you don't just have hope, you actually can engage in action. And that really is what motivates you at the end of the day.
That's a wonderful, empowering message. 30 seconds each. I know you got a lot more time. What gives you hope, particularly in these difficult times?
There is a large evidence of positive policy shifts in different countries, and they actually worked. Secondly, more people uphold migrant rights, more people are committed to promote integration, empathy, to build bridges and partnerships rather than walls and inequalities. And initiatives and actors like the ones that gathered us here in Armenia aim at advocating for social, moral, and policy change.
Ali, what gives you hope?
I think at this point when the United States is becoming more insular, our institutions are actually becoming more inclusive. The fastest growth in faith institutions in the U.S. is coming from the Latino or the Asian population. More and more companies in the U.S. are doing business beyond the borders of the U.S., so it demands inclusivity. So I take hope from moments like when the United States pushed back against the administration's efforts to ban Muslim immigration. I take hope from standing in front of 75 Trump-voting Idaho dairymen who cared about their Latino workforce as an extension of their families. I take hope from the fact that I think the majority of Americans want to be a part of a constructive dialogue on these issues.
Lori, what gives you hope?
I think, seeing the results of the Humanitarian Index about how young people are more receptive gives me a lot of hope, and that was discussed before. But I think attitudes are starting to change, particularly in my country. Don't get me wrong, there's still some serious racism that goes on in my country, but just last night, the Conservative Party had their leadership race, and they're the official opposition in my country right now. Not only did they reject the candidate who had the anti-Muslim stance and the racist stance against immigration, they so soundly rejected her that she got less votes than a guy who dropped out 2 weeks ago. So that gives me a lot of hope.
Great. Hovik, aside from your insistence on your youth, what gives you hope?
All right, I'm worried and I'm hopeful. I'm worried because Feiruz, who is a Syrian refugee in Zatari camp, with whom I'm in touch with on WhatsApp, I was chatting with her earlier, her husband and one son are in Europe. Her other son, against my advice, took the perilous journey through Turkey via illegal movement and is stuck in Turkey, and she and her other son are in Zatari camp. So I'm worried because we have many of those cases where we need to do much more to resolve, and I'm not going to go into the layers of the complexity. I'm hopeful because I was also chatting with Abdelrazak, who I met. He's a Somali refugee I met in Tunisia on the border with Libya. And Abdelrazak fled the war in Libya, came to Tunisia, and we resettled Abdelrazak to the US. Abdelrazak now has learned English. He didn't know English at all. He's writing movie and theater scripts in Hollywood. He has yet to sell them. So he's working as a cab driver, and he says he's making enough to have his hobby also. And he's helping NGOs who do resettlement as an interpreter. So I'm hopeful that we will have many of those very positive stories to tell.
Great. Sherry, what gives you hope?
Thank you. So I get to hope from a couple of things. We're working with institutions in Kurdistan, with the government, to build in greater protections for the most vulnerable in society, and we need to strengthen those protections, and we have to strengthen those responses, and I think there's an effort underway to do that, and that's very important. But on the individual side, we can't erase what has happened to people. We can't take away the trauma and the loss and the grief that they feel. But people can live again. and they can contribute and they can heal, and we can help them integrate this terrible thing that happened to be a part of their life rather than their whole story. And I've seen that happen, and that's what we work for every day.
Great. Well, let me just say that what gives me hope as the son of an undocumented immigrant who came to the United States in the 1930s and is now standing on a stage in Armenia talking about immigrant integration with all of you, is that there's struggles that people go through, there's ways in which families try to stay together, there's systems that people fight to change to make sure that it's fairer. And what gives me hope, and I think should give you hope too, are these 5 heroes and heroines on this stage doing this very magnificent work. Let's give them a big round of applause. And what gives me not hope is I don't actually know what's happening next, so you can let us know. Okay.
Luckily, Manuel, I do, and it's a 25-minute break now. Really, just a final applause, actually, for what was a spectacular panel. Thank you very much, everyone. 25 minutes, and then we're here for the final session. Thank you.